All right. Hello. I hope you can hear me. Test, test, test. Is there anybody out there? Um, let's see. So far, no comments. I hope someone is there and watching. Can't check right now. So yeah, I hope someone's there and can hear me. Because so far, all I get is nothing. Yeah. All right, everybody. Welcome to me finally streaming again, and I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see me. Let's see if anyone has actually found their way here and is not watching Eurovision. Wait, let me check something because so far I can't see comments, which, would be neat, wouldn't it? Oh, there you are. First comment. Hello, Chris. How you doing? I hope you can hear me. Doing the usual check thing, and I'll just, you know. Hey, Jared. How you doing? It is evening here, so I guess I'm gonna do the thing. Cheers, everybody, and I'm glad to finally be back online and be back with a live stream after April being a bit chaotic, to put it mildly. Because, as I said, I was traveling a lot, and this seems to be like the only Saturday I can do a live stream in May. I hope June will be a bit easier. Hey, Biggest, yeah, yeah, that part. Yeah, so let's talk about stuff and books, and I hope you have had a fun week. We had Christ Ascension on Thursday, which meant that I was hiking with friends. We walked for like 20 kilometers and maybe drank some alcohol, and then we camped on a field that one of my friends' families, yeah, they have like a farm, so they have like fields where we could just like camp out and misbehave in public, which is kind of what I do anyway. But fun thing, those people are also people I have an offline book club with. So we didn't talk about books though. Except, of course, me obviously telling everyone to go and read Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber and Cannibal Capitalist by Nancy Fraser, which you also should do if you haven't yet. Hey, Kadia, how you doing? Still enjoying Forge of Darkness, I hope. Yeah, I was wondering if anyone would show up today because I completely forgot that whole Eurovision thing until I looked at some discords today and was like, oh shit, this is also this week. But then again, I'm not sure how many people that watch my stuff are interested in Eurovision Song Contest things. So we'll see. Anyway, yeah, I started reading Cahokia Jazz today, and I'm really enjoying it so far. It's really well written. I see the comparisons to Michael Chabon's The Yiddish Policeman's Union already, and I've only read like the first part. It's separated by days, and I've just read Monday, and I'm going to read the next part tomorrow, I think, or on Monday. We'll see. It's really good. It's really fun. Well, not fun. It's a crime novel, police procedural kind of detective story. Set in a fictional alternate history where the city of Cahokia does actually still exist, and different groups of people live there together. And then it's the 1920s, and you have a very violent murder and things will probably go from there somewhere. Yeah, I agree with your assessment there, Kadia. I mean, yeah, it's not for me. It never was for me, and I feel the interesting thing with like stuff like the Eurovision thing is like it's become this very very weird, its own kind of thing. People, just because it is that thing. No one actually cares about the songs at the end of the day. It's very much an an event that is completely empty and is sort of like celebrated because of that. And it's something I find fascinating, but also from a distance. I might want to read Space Opera by Catherine Valente, though, which is about the Eurovision Song Contest. And Catherine Valente is definitely someone I trust to tackle that topic in a fun way. Only in chapter 5. I don't even know how many chapters Forge of Darkness has, Katja. It's been a while since I last read it, and it's really, really good. But it feels very different from the Malazan Book of the Fallen or the other or the Esselmont novels. It feels very very different in a lot of ways. But it's I like the more like tragic kind of feel to it. See, yeah, Chris, of course it's terrible music, but there's a lot of music I personally find terrible, and it's still like not about the music, but about like this weird event thing. In the same way that a lot of like sort of sports stuff also is, but with like team sports, like I don't know, football, world championships or whatever, World Cups. I see like more of like a connection for whatever reason because sports, at least in Europe, often is like very very well tied to like thoughts of like national identity or whatever, in a way that the Eurovision Song Contest, at least for like most part of Europe, with the possible exception of I don't know Sweden or whatever, like music is not that well tied into say into like a national consciousness. So while every country sends someone there, like, no one really cares about that sort of like national connection. I think that because yeah, music is a very different beast from sports, even though obviously trying to make it competitive does sort of tie into that. There's some really interesting stuff when it comes to entertainment. How professional sports are well have become far more of like an entertainment kind of thing that you can find in some of the later like stuff that say Adorno wrote on the culture industry, and of course the Spectacle by Guido Borg. That there of course as well. I find that very interesting to see how sports kind of moves away from that, whereas like music in this case sort of tries to move towards that sports competition kind of thing in like the opposite direction, and then they both like end up in this like weird meaningless space where billions of imaginary money are like burnt up for well to keep people quiet, I guess, and maybe sell something on the way. Hey, also, how you doing so far? Stopped writing and drawing? Yeah, there's definitely a lot of flag waving there, but it feels so meaningless. Like, but maybe that's like a very specific, like I don't know, German problem because like obviously Germany's always sucked at this like song competition thing, and Germany has like well, we don't have like that kind of sort of like ongoing national identity in a lot of cases, and the people that do have it are the kind of people you really don't want to have anywhere around because they're fascists. So there's that, I think. That sounds very tasty. Also, I realized that I forgot to buy food, so I ordered pizza earlier today. So I did that because the whole hiking thing stopped today because we, camped out in the fields for like 2 days, and I kind of forgot to buy food when I came home. I was, too wrecked to do that, so I decided to just take a nap and get fresh for a conversation with you guys. So yeah, to turn away from the stupid Eurovision things, like, what are you guys reading at the moment? Because as I say, like, I'm now reading Cahokia Jazz. I'm also rereading A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, which is, quite the ride, because it's like a super thick one, and it's sort of history of philosophy, history of the mind, philosophy, that kind of stuff. And it's really interesting the way he talks about his version of like how we ended up from, a very religious society in the Middle Ages, how we came from that to what we have, what he calls a secular age now, where religion is a very different beast in a lot of ways. Like, where having different religions, or being an unbeliever or a believer, are both options for as compared to a world where being religion is basically the only way of looking at the world, and how that shifts. And I'm not quite sure I follow all of his ideas. I think he gets deism wrong, but I think it's an interesting way of looking at the world. I think something, and which is why I'm rereading. It's like something that I've always struggled with when I, read fantasy books. A lot of people in fantasy don't get religion right for exactly that reason, that we, especially when they try to sort of do like historical fiction, or more like historically accurate, well, not accurate, but more medieval seeming worlds, and that they kind of get religion wrong because they lack that idea that in such a world, not believing is just not an option. It's like, not even, I mean, maybe there are like very few individuals who kind of contemplate the idea that the gods or God doesn't exist and so forth, but it's not necessarily an option. And stepping back into that specific frame of mind, to that like worldview, I think for like a fantasy novel or a historical novel, is very difficult, and a lot of fantasy writers kind of fail doing that, fail at it. And that's something that's always like irked me with a lot of fantasies. Like, you have this very weird world of possibly even including magic, and your characters are running around being atheists. To go back to like the Terry Pratchett things, like, it's very difficult to be an atheist in a world where the gods can just like come by and just like throw a rock through your roof, through your window. And I think that's sort of like that thing that a lot of fantasy kind of misses, and it's something that I wanted to sort of think about a bit more, which is why I am rereading the Charles Taylor things. It's just not something I can read all the day, because it's 900 pages of philosophy and history of philosophy, which is a bit dry. Oh yeah, right. The Northern Lights. They were visible all the way up to Germany. Like, we were camping out in a field, so yeah, they were Northern Lights. Biggest, yeah. I think The Heroes is possibly the strongest of the three standalones. I think it does a lot of stuff really well, like this idea of like having the entire novel be like basically just one battle over like, I don't know, 3 days or whatever it is. Like, it allows him to do a lot of stuff that you see in like classic like war movies and stuff like that, and to kind of pull that into fantasy, I think is very strong. I kind of like, but I also did. It's also been forever since I read Best Served Cold, so I my memories of that one are not as vivid as the ones of The Heroes. So there's that. But I think it works really well because also, Abercrombie, the way he writes battles, where he just always like jumps from viewpoint to viewpoint every time someone gets killed, and you kind of move through the battle. I think that comes off really, really strong in The Heroes, which is something I approve of. Nice, nice, Chris. I have not read the Gap Cycle yet. I've only read the first trilogy of Thomas Carbon and by Donaldson. I need to read more Donalds, and I just haven't gotten to it yet. The the usual problem of having too many books and too little time. Yes, yeah, I agree. Also, it's just like really, really well structured in a way that both Red Country and Best Served Cold are not. The other issue with Red Country that I have is, of course, that it being a Western, he has to do something native, and I don't think it worked really well. But then again, I think it may be really hard to pull off like a fantasy Western without making it, really cheesy or whatever, because it's very difficult as a white British author to kind of get get any form of like native culture in any way right. I don't think that's something most people can do. I remember reading, what's it called, The Incorruptibles, I think, by John Horner Jacobs or whatever his name is. That also does deliberately go for like a fantasy Western kind of thing. It's mostly about like a sort of like a riverboat journey upriver through what is clearly fantasy America. And there it also didn't really feel well, which is why I'm interested to see what Francis Spufford does with Cahokia Jazz, because it's a city of Cahokia, so there's a lot of like native influences there, and I'm interested to see if it feels more believable, I think, which we will see. But definitely something I'm very much enjoying so far. The next thing I really want to read is on Tuesday. On Tuesday, there's the new Peter S. Beagle novel coming out. I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons, and if there's one person who can do sort of whimsical fantasy that is both funny and also like very melancholic at the same time, I think it's Peter S. Beagle. So I'm very much looking forward to that one. That should be a lot of fun. But it's also like another short one because Beagle's novels are always fairly short, so that's something I'm going to read on Tuesday. I'm really excited about it. Yeah, I agree. Also, like the overall thing is really well done in Red Country. I just didn't really like the ending part, like that weird like dragon thing. I just didn't like that part that much. It's also been like, I don't know, probably like a decade since I read it, so I'm a bit hazy on it. Just remember, like he gets the feeling right of a Western movie, I think, and that's probably because Abercrombie, as someone who's worked in television, is really good at style, at setting up scenes and getting sort of like the style, the visuals of a genre right. He's really good at that, and it sometimes breaks down in other parts of his writing, but he's really good at picking up on what makes a genre feel like a specific genre, and that definitely also carries over into Red Country. It's more like the general, like that part about the natives that I really didn't like back then, and I don't know how I would feel about it if I read it now. But probably I should at some point reread them. I reread the trilogy, and then I read the second trilogy, and I don't know. I have my issues with the whole setup of his world and the wizards, of course. But we talked about the fact that I think they are very, they're at least structurally anti-Semitic, the depiction. But I don't think it's on purpose. It's just like certain structures that are easy to fall into kind of come through with that. Which is kind of what I didn't like about the last trilogy, and of course that it kind of goes nowhere at the end. Abercrombie writing about like things that could change, or to earth-shattering, like world-shattering events, and then everything just stays the same. It's sort of like an attitude, like a philosophy behind it. That level of cynicism is like, no matter what happens, we can have a revolution, but things will just be the same kind of shit afterwards. I'm like, if that's all you can, put into a book, if nothing ever changes, I'm not sure if that's the kind of book I want to read too much about. Because I think, I mean, obviously, it's a good idea to kind of argue against, say, the hero's journey, and like the world is changed when the hero comes back. And I very much disagree with Campbell on that. But like, if your version of like writing against that is to go like, well, the heroes come back and everything is still shit and nothing has changed, I just wish, or I believe there should be other options of dealing with that dilemma of like how to write a fantasy story than those two. Yeah, that's the point. It's like Abercrombie might be one of the most cynical of the grimdark writers. I think he kind of gets away with it because of his very specific, very terse dialogue style. This very, very, very dark but dry kind of humor that he puts into that stuff. I think he gets away with it, and it's easy to kind of overlook how incredibly cynical he is about these things, compared to, I don't know, some Mark Lawrence or what's his name, R. Scott Baker, and people like that. I think he gets away with it because it feels kind of funny. But if you start thinking about like his actual, the things he does, so the actual sort of like message or ideas behind the novels of Joe Abercrombie's books are like, well, everything's shit, and that's it. And I'm like, yeah, I'd rather have like everything's shit, but we could probably, maybe, possibly change it in the future. But that hope is important, I think, both to fantasy and other genres as well. Yeah, exactly. Also, A Land Fit for Heroes kind of works better because, yeah, there is hope, or well, not necessarily hope, but there is change happens. People actually change and move on and become possibly even better people. Maybe differently bad, but there is some form of change, and I think that's important. Yeah, I can see that also. That like being just like overall, frustrated, or just being overloaded by cynicism with Abercrombie. I mean, the good part is that like they usually are very well written, well edited in a way that they're fast reads in general. If you can push through the cynicism, they are definitely very, very easy reads compared to some other forms of fantasy that we may read from time to time. I don't know. It's easier to go through a Joe Abercrombie book than it is, for example, for me to go through like a Robin Hobb book, just by writing style, I think. But then again, I've only read like 6 Robin Hobb books because I don't know, reluctant to read Robin Hobb books and talk about them, because like all of fantasy or adult fantasy booktube is so enamored with Robin Hobb that I'm like, I don't know, man. I think you're overhyping her. And I'm like, I mean, obviously, great writer and everything. Don't get me wrong, but like, she might be the one author that you're not allowed to ever say anything negative about on Fantasy Booktube in lots of ways, I think. And me being a bit of a contrarian kind of person, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna read Robin Hobb when the hype is over. No one talks about her anymore. That's when I'm gonna reread and then further read Robin Hobb again. I am not the biggest fan of R. Scott Baker. He definitely can write. Really, he can write. Let's put it that way. He's not a bad writer. I think I only read the first trilogy, the Prince of Nothing trilogy. I think that the way he does stuff sometimes is, well, overly ambitious, and some people get sort of, I guess, sort of taken in by him being very ambitious, but I don't think he actually succeeds with all of his ambitions. And the fact that he also is like very cynical and goes into this like, yeah, well, everything's predestined. There's no free will. I don't know. It doesn't come together. It feels it often reads a bit like early 2000s internet atheist edgy to me, but they're good reads. I mean, technically they're like well written, and if you don't know too much about about the First Crusade, you might actually enjoy it even more. I mean, obviously, a lot of people that I respect really enjoy those books. It might just be a me problem, which is, most problems. What's not true, Kadya? that Baker is edgy, or something else? Oh, but well, I haven't checked that, Kadya, because I did not watch YouTube videos on the internet while I was hiding in a tent on a field. So I have no idea what Tori thinks about Ship of Magic. But I also don't think I actively follow Tori's channel anyway. So why would I know? No, sorry, I'm not coming for you, Katja. I'm just like, I don't know. Yeah, so okay, so Tori doesn't like Robin Hobb. That's nice to hear that someone has other opinions. And since Robin Hobb is obviously a traditionally published author, it's also fine to have negative reviews of her books, right? So yeah, I don't know. As like the Robin Hobb things, I have all those books, and me being a very old person, indeed, I read the Farseer trilogy in, I don't know, would have to look it up, but I think somewhere in like before 2010 is my point. Probably before 2008 is when I read Farseer because of George R. Martin. Yeah, of course, people can still live after saying they don't like Hobb. That's true. I was definitely exaggerating here, but it kind of feels that like Hobb is the one author that like most adult booktubers are sort of have agreed on, praising for her characters and stuff, and prose and all of that stuff. Like, so now, no, I read Hobb back in 2006, 7 ish, while waiting for George R. Martin to finally finish A Dance with Dragons. Those were the days when we could still, wait only like 5 or 6 years for a new book instead of like 10, 15, whatever it is now. And at the time, Martin was like recommending books on his website, and was like, "Hey, this is stuff I like, and if you're waiting for my next book, maybe check out this stuff." And he praised the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, and that's when I read it. And then I also continued and read the Life Ship Traders trilogy in around 2012 ish, I think. So and yeah, that they were good books. I wonder what I would think about them now, though, because I definitely have changed as a reader since then. I think I would be more critical than back then when I was like, wow, there is more actual, modern epic fantasy written that, back when I didn't know anything about anything, is my point. Now I still don't know anything about anything, but more so. No, I read Game of Thrones in 2004 because a friend of mine at university who we talked about fantasy before, and then he came back from like Christmas break, winter break, and he's like, "Hey, My cousin who lives in the US just brought me this book. It's fucking amazing. You got to read this. And that was in 2004. And that's when I read the first three books. And then I had to wait for like a year or so for Feast for Crows to come out. And then, that's that. And obviously, I reread all three, the first three for Feast. And then I reread all four before Dance. And then I said I will reread all five when book six comes out, and that's when I will read and possibly even talk about A Song of Ice and Fire. But until then, I have better things to do with my life. So yeah, possibly in 2 years, I think. Hey, Price of Iron. Yeah, I agree. Baker definitely did. Well, let's put it this way: he definitely was very inspired by a few other authors and writers. But yeah, there's still like far worse writers and far worse books out there. But I think sometimes we, as like the very specific parts of the adult epic fantasy community, we tend to be very, very, very proud and very happy about every book that uses long words and stuff, sort of to differentiate ourselves from the Brandon Sandersons who just write big books with like few words or short words, and because we want to feel more adult and more smart. And no, we're not smarter. And I think there's a tendency to sort of like overpraise or the few authors we kind of have agreed on to be like the good guys, so to speak. And it's definitely Stephen Erickson is part of that. Robin Hobb kind of falls into that for some people. R. Scott Baker falls into that. Possibly some others, but I'd be hard pressed to figure out who else might be part of that a very specific group of, maybe Ted Williams, but not that many people have recently read the Memory, Sorrow, Thorn, so maybe he's a bit out there because he's too old. There's obviously there's others, but I just can't remember any of them at the moment. But I feel there is that tendency to sort of overstate the complexity or the I don't know, value or whatever of those authors we kind of have agreed upon to sort of use as our mark of distinction from the fantasy reading proletariat, I guess. Well, by Chris, if you want to read The Song of Ice and Fire, there are far worse books, and it had a huge impact on a lot of other writers, Joe Abercrombie amongst them, I would say. So like from like a genre history kind of standpoint, they are essential reading in a way that I don't know. I would say The Wheel of Time is not. And even that one definitely, Wheel of Time is also sort of essential if you want to understand fantasy history. And yeah, well, I mean, there are some very problematic aspects to A Song of Ice and Fire. Like, you got to deal with the fact that George R. Martin really loves to write about underage girls for whatever reason, in a very creepy way. And I don't think that ever changes in the books. In like my memory is like the way he writes about, like, I don't know, the Daenerys is just like really, really creepy. Oh yeah, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell might also be one of those books that people really can't understate the high literary quality of that book. And to be fair, it is a very well done book, even though I think there's a large block in there that could have been shortened when Strange hangs out in like Spain fighting Napoleon or whatever. That part just is not very, very very convincing to me. be fair, Kadia, book 4 is better than its reputation, and book 5 is really bad of A Song of Ice and Fire. Really kind of. I thought at the time that I noticed like a drop in quality and just the prose of book 5, not even the plot. It's like the way he writes. Martin wrote it. That book feels less convincing. I don't know. Maybe he just like really like sort of lost his interest in the world. I don't know about that, but like, I think it's one of those things that fantasy. There was this trend, like especially, and I think that's one of the places where we have to blame Robert Jordan. When Wheel of Time started selling so well as a series, sort of it became more and more like the thing for epic fantasy to never be just a standalone, or not even a trilogy if we can help it, and just turn it into like a 10 series book, 10 book series and whatnot. And I think the problem with that is, if you commit to writing, I don't know, 10 books of 1,000 pages each, that's 10,000 pages. That's a lot of writing. That takes like the next 10 years. And if you're not incredibly committed to that very specific world, as a writer, I suspect that you want to write about other stuff in those 10 years, during those 10 years. And that makes it very difficult to sort of keep that thing going. I feel that George R. Martin, being the kind of author that he is, and already having had like, I don't know, 20 years of writing, probably 20 and a bit more. I don't know when his first story got published. Like having written all these other novels, like the vampire novel, which is actually really cool, the Fever Dream. I really like that one. Or like science fiction stuff, being all over the place. I don't think he's the kind of person who can commit to just writing that one story for the next, well, at this point, 30 years. And I think that probably not 30 years. Although, yeah, almost 30 years at this point, right? The first one came out in 94. So, yeah, I don't think he's the kind of person who can just like live in that very specific headspace in a lot of times. He has to sort of force himself to go back to that world, even though he probably would like to do something very, very different because his mind has just moved on. I think that's the danger of these like long series. I don't think it's the same with Patrick Rothfuss, but I can see like Martin sort of struggling with just like going back to Westeros because he probably wants to do something else. Probably like run his cinema and I don't know, talk about football. I have no idea what he does these days. I don't know. Also, I have never watched the show. Yeah, exactly. Also, Esselmont and Erickson and Esselmont are dedicated to the Malazan world because they've done so much in that world over the years, right? Like they played in that world together for like 10, 15 years before anyone, ever started writing novels in it. So I think it's much easier for them to go into that mindset, even though, at least, Erickson has written other stuff and does, the what's it called? The Star Trek parody thing, the Willful Child trilogy and stuff like that. He can move back into that Malazan mindset, I guess, much easier because it's such a large part of his world, of his life, I guess, in a way that I don't think Westeros was for Martin, right? He kind of tossed that thing off and was like, well, we'll see how that goes. Yeah, Fever Dream, exactly, Chris and Claudia. I really enjoyed that one. It's like, oh, this is fun. The Windhaven one he wrote with, what's her name? Liza Tuttle? Is that her name? That one didn't work for me. I mean, the idea was cool, the world was really cool, and then at some point I just like got incredibly bored by the story. But yeah, I think part of that problem is that we kind of expect, or the market expected at the time, publishers and the market kind of expected, epic fantasy has to be 10 novels of 1,000 pages. Otherwise, it won't be actual epic fantasy, which is one of those things that really, really annoyed me with that, the death of epic fantasy, or whatever that video was that, what's his name? I'm blanking, but you know what I mean. What's his name? Leo. Did back Patrick Leo did a couple of weeks ago about the death of epic fantasy, and he's like, yeah, well, there's no more like 1,000-page books coming out. It's like, if your definition of epic fantasy is it has to have like 1,000 pages, you're doing epic fantasy wrong. And if you want to read thick books, there's still thick books coming out, so you need to figure out what your actual definition is, and that kind of, you know. Oh, I didn't know that Best Served Cold was going to be made into a movie. I think it's probably a good idea to take that one because it's probably the most easiest to adapt from his standalones and from the trilogy, because you know it's shorter and has a fairly small cast of characters, right? So you just have, you know, it's easier to do that than to have like the full on like First Law with all its different characters and the large shit going on. So I think Best Served Cold might work really well in that regard. I think that's one of the things that I like about Abercrombie, that he actually managed to write standalone fantasy novels after his trilogy and not do the whole 10 books thing. Yeah, I've heard very bad things about the last season of Game of Thrones, but as I said, like I haven't watched any of it. I think the point where people got mad at the whole Daenerys plot line, I'm like, yeah, but that was in the books from the beginning. That's if you thought this her arc would end in any different way, you very much misread the books or the earlier seasons. I mean, I don't know how clearly they signaled that part in the show, because you know I haven't watched it, but I remember back in the day, Martin saying that when he split uh, book 4 into book 4 and 5 and A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, like these books, and why he split them geographically and not temporarily, he was like, yeah, these books are both about a mad queen. One is about, you know, Cersei, and the other one is about Daenerys, and it's about their descent into madness. And I'm like, yeah, kind of tells where this is going, and I think a lot of people kind of overlooked that part. Okay, I have not read that Price of Iron. Have you read Neoliberalism, A Short History by David Harvey, though? And do they go in different directions, or is this going to go into like a business in a different direction? Because it sounds like something I might be interested in. How many seasons were there? I suspect there were 8 seasons of Game of Thrones. Now that you said like you didn't watch the last one after you really didn't like 7. Yeah, I don't know. As I like, I think Game of Thrones is also like very much like a 90s kind of thing, and that's like the other part that I find interesting in that whole like is epic fantasy dead kind of discussion. Is like I feel our general zeitgeist has moved on from that kind of story. Writing Game of Thrones, if Game of Thrones were published today, it would feel outdated. It would feel like weirdly out of time in a way. And I think that's something that epic fantasy has to reckon with, like how to write epic fantasy in a post-pandemic 2020 plus kind of time, where to go with that, what to do with that. And I think that's something that a lot of epic fantasy has not yet figured out, or the writers that are writing relevant books right now are not telling their stories through whatever the trappings of epic fantasy might be. And I think that's another interesting part, right? It's like how would you define epic fantasy? And I wouldn't know. I Because you know, if we're going back to it just being big, on having lots of pages, lots of characters, and so forth, I don't know if that's a sufficient definition. And if it's sort of like it has to be sort of world spanning, it has to sort of have like a world threatening event happening somewhere. If that's part of it, then yeah, I guess the things that feel earth shattering or world destroying to us in a, post-pandemic or sort of post-pandemic age during, a war in Ukraine and a war and so forth in Israel and Palestine and all the other stuff that is happening at the moment, like, and climate change on the horizon. Like, I think we need a different language for that, or epic fantasy has not yet fully gone there, which is interesting because, George R. Martin with the others and the whole like snow and ice thing, winter thing, you could have done something climate related with that, but he doesn't go there because he's interested in retelling what he thinks about medieval England. And yeah, I don't know how to do epic fantasy right now, even if I were a talented writer and if I had like a no problem finding a publisher and all that other stuff out of the way. It's like, I don't know what to do with epic fantasy at the moment. I think it needs a very new, fresh impulse that I have no idea where it will come from. So I think that's like something that a lot of the people talking about how publishers are no longer publishing epic fantasy. I don't think there's much epic fantasy to be done at the moment. And anything else you could come up with at the moment in epic fantasy would just be sort of like fan service, playing the greatest hits and not doing anything new. You can do that, of course, a couple of times, but at some point that gets boring, just doing the same thing again, only, I don't know, more of it, the same grimdark thing, right? It's like you can obviously always up the body count, but that at some point that doesn't make it more grim or dark or more cynical or whatever. You need like a fresh impulse, and I think epic fantasy or traditional fantasy in that regard kind of needs a new sort of like bigger impulse in the way science fiction had with, like, say, cyberpunk coming out in the early 80s. That was like a big sort of like shift within the genre, and like other like classic sci-fi authors going like into space and what I could then like add the tools, the new lenses that cyberpunk had brought, and you can just like add that stuff to your space opera, whatever. And I think epic fantasy kind of needs that at the moment. I don't think dragon porn will be it, but who knows? Maybe I should read what's it called, Fourth Wing. Yeah, Malazan, I would say, does feel epic. I think that's like the other things. Like, I think like Black Company also feels epic in its very specific way. There are things that make something feel epic to us, but I think it's one of those very, very hard to define sort of weird terms. And I would definitely read epic mermaid fantasy. I mean, speaking of, there was a book published like last month, I think. I keep forgetting what it's called. I just like glanced over it at some sort of, probably it's more like an urban fantasy, yeah, whatever fantasy, but it's about this city that has like people living underwater and people living over water, and there's some conflict between those two groups and whatnot. It's probably not going to be a good novel, but I like the idea of actually doing stuff with underwater. So there is maybe epic mermaid fantasy. I just forgot the name of. Maybe it was called The Sunken People or something like that. I will have to look it up, but so there is epic mermaid fantasy out there, I think. Yeah, but that's the thing also. I don't know. Has Grimdark already been deconstructed? I mean, yeah, I mean, hard to say. I think it's difficult to do that because it's already like Grimdark is very postmodern in a lot of ways, and deconstructing postmodernism is always a bit difficult. You would have to apply some very specific thematic lens to do that, I think. But maybe once I've actually finished Frederick Jameson's The Desire for Utopia, which is a collection of science fiction that he wrote as a Marxist literary scholar and academic critic, maybe that will help. I don't know if sci-fi has never suffered from it. I think the issue with sci-fi, Chris, is that it has sort of bloomed into all these different things that kind of work in parallel, and I think fantasy has the same breadth of genre, but because of very specific like publishing things in a lot of people's sort of imagination, or like in our minds, it's very simple to go like, well, fantasy is sword dude stuff, and then maybe also fantasy is vampire and werewolf porn. And that's sort of like the only two modes of fantasy that we kind of conceive, even though obviously we all know that there's far more than that. But it's sort of like it's fairy tales, it's monster porn, and it's which we sometimes call urban fantasy, and it's dudes with swords. And whereas with science fiction, it never got typecast into these like two or three specific things. And I think that's a key difference. It's not so much that fantasy doesn't have these things; it's more that in people's sort of like conception, it kind of fails to register that we have all these other things going on around there as well. If that makes any sense. Yeah, when you say dragons mean equals fantasy, kind of, there's a funny thing. Like I watched an interview with Lavi Tidar, and was talking about what sci-fi is. And it's like sci-fi is books with spaceships on the cover, which is very much the same thing as dragons on the cover means fantasy. I never watched Buffy, biggest, so I wouldn't know. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people use Buffy as sort of like almost porn, but I never watched it, so I wouldn't know anything about it. And but I think like it definitely influenced a lot of like both the language of say urban fantasy, but also the language of cinema in a lot of ways. The whole like just reading stuff in general, like having like these quippy one liners and stuff like that. You can see that obviously in the very much not Buffy influenced and not World of Darkness role playing game influenced Dresden Files, which are full of like quippy one liners and well, of course, the nipple piercing counting of the main character, which yeah. Yeah, I agree also that Grimdark definitely was a reaction in a lot of ways to other stuff. But yeah, I think there are ways of moving beyond that. I think in a lot of like if you would read, for example, what's it called? Uh, uh, the fifth season, like The Broken Earth. I was confused with like other books that have like broken in there somewhere. Uh, so the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jameson. I think if you count that as fantasy, not as science fiction, which you can, I think it does move beyond grimdark because it is grim and dark, but it does also ultimately have, well, maybe hope or at least future beyond that. And I think that might be one. There is another one, the Mirror Empire trilogy by Cameron Hurley, which I think is not necessarily his strongest work, but it does very interesting fantasy things in the classic format of a trilogy, and it certainly is grim and it certainly is dark in a lot of ways, but it's also does fascinating other stuff around that. Yeah, yeah, cozy fantasy might be part of that. I think the there's certainly a need or a market for like cozy books, both in fantasy and science fiction. I think just because there's a lot of people that feel oppressed by how fucked up the world is, right? So if you want escapism, then I feel that form of cozy stuff might be it. But I'm not quite sure if it at the end has like the staying power of being a lot of that stuff. I mean, having if it leads to just like having more sort of like queer representation or representation of marginalized people, which is very much tied into that whole cozy thing in general, I think then it may have a lot sort of an impact on fantasy as a whole if we see that also showing up in other places, maybe including more having brightening up your grimdark by just having sometimes having normal people do normal stuff might be something. But I don't think if cozy fantasy has more to say or more to tell, right? That's sort of like the point. Is like, if it's just like, hey, I want to give my brain like a nice hot bubbly bath and let it relax for like I don't know, 200 pages, then that's definitely great. But I don't think that's enough to sort of do more than be that. And the question is like, does like a larger impulse for a genre, does it have to bring more than that? I don't know. But then again, I haven't read Legends and Lattes, and I don't know if I want to. I don't think it's a book that would work well for me. At least at the moment, I'm not in a cozy mood, so maybe I should stay away from it, or just like read out of interest at some point to see what the fuss is about, and then recognize that it's not for me. Yeah, I mean, Jameson does have very, very specific, weird, and own unique things with all her stuff, both like the 100,000 Kingdoms trilogy, and I haven't read the Dream Blood one yet, but I'm sure it's great because like everything Jameson does is great, or at least the way she talks about stuff or the way she writes books speaks to me. I mean, that's like another part. It's like I have a very unique, not unique, but like a very specific way of reading books and a very specific, you know, set of things that will work for me in a book, and I'm probably not representative of the larger trends in fantasy readership. Obviously, otherwise I would be reading Fourth Wing again or whatever. Yeah, listen to Biggest when it comes to medical advice. I am not an expert there. Hey Daniel, how you doing? I agree, Price of Iron. Yes, fantasy, and we had psychedelic fantasy in the 60s and 70s. We had that, and then kind of stopped doing that, which is a bit of a shame because yeah, more psychedelic aesthetics would work. And like I said, that Mirror Empire trilogy, I think maybe it's called the Broken Heavens or something. Because of course, too much broken stuff in fantasy, but like by Cameron Hurley does go into sort of somewhat psychedelic. It certainly has a lot of like really, really dangerous plant stuff because it's sort of like partly set in like a jungle setting. So it's a very, very dangerous plants is are there. So there is a level of psychedelia in there. But yeah, I agree. There should be more psychedelics. There should also be more wind whales, which is why Glenn Cook is so great because he does that shit from time to time. Yeah, Daniel, welcome, welcome to the club. I think some of us might be somewhat stressed out by the rise of global fascism. Yeah, I've never read much Clive Barker. I should probably read more of that, but yeah, that's always an option. And you can always fry some shrimps also and see if that has any effect on your writing abilities. Nerds, yeah, I don't know, biggest if more nerds would take drugs. I feel like the self image of a lot of nerds kind of makes it very difficult for them to take drugs. I think like the last time we saw nerds take a lot of drugs was like during the counterculture, and that part of the counterculture that then ended up being, the IT sector in fucking Silicon Valley. A lot of those people, did a lot of drugs in the 60s and then and in the 70s, and then that's the last time nerds did drugs, I think, which is sad. Hey, Ida, I don't know what you missed. Me talking about fantasy, talking about why Eurovision Song Contest sucks, and obviously the rise of global fascism and how it's kind of bumming us out, I guess. Yeah, yeah, shrooms are definitely not the kind of thing that you want to write on, I guess. Yeah, price line. Yeah, accelerationism is definitely a great coping mechanism, but I don't know. Not necessarily much more than that, is it? So yeah, I think that's mostly what we talked about, and of course, Game of Thrones and why Game of Thrones is Game of Thrones, and the fact that apparently I'm not the only person who may have reservations about Robin Hobb. Although technically, I mean, I really enjoyed the books that I read. Yeah, but that's the point. Drugs and fascism and climate change, I think, are themes. At least two of them are themes that should sort of like be more in epic fantasy. Sorry, the chat moved on, so need to find. Wow, an epic romantasy adventure. I um, I don't think I've ever read romantasy, which might be something I should do at some point. So now that you've read an epic, written an epic romantasy adventure, Ida, what does make it epic for you? Because that's something we struggled with earlier. It's like to define epic fantasy, and I'm like still not sure. But since you've written one, I am enlisting you as an expert here. But if it's about the breakdown of a marriage, is it still romantasy, or is it sort of like more like a terrible Jonathan Franzen novel set in Middle Earth? Ah, okay. Well, that's like if you're one of your arc readers called you epic, I guess that's that's as, I think that's kind of the problem. That like epic is sort of one of those like really really vibe based sort of terms, and one's like it's a bit like porn. It's like I see I recognize it when I see it, and it's very hard to define. So yeah, is it is it self published, or is it traditionally published? Or will it be self published or traditionally published? Your epic fantasy or romantasy. Well, what can I say? I have a very specific taste in beers because advertisement does work for me. Hey, exponentiate. Yeah, I think the happy ending is sort of relevant for romantasy or romance. Yeah, I think like world saving might be another one that kind of makes stuff epic, I guess. You live in Finland, right? Price of Iron. I mean, 21 euros for a fifth of vodka. Yeah, well, could be worse. You could be trying to do that in Oslo. Try finding out how much it costs you there. Okay, self-published. Does it have a title, Ida? So now everyone can know, and then they can pre-order the book in July. And we have done our duty here to actually do what we might call promotion for a book. Yeah. But that's yeah. I mean, maybe you should change your name from Price of Iron to Price of Alcohol. I don't know. Sorry, it's not shameless self-promotion. If I'm asking you about it. Marble Sun. Moonward Chain and Marble Sun. Sounds good. Sounds good so far. So I guess what we need to do is remember all of that, writing it down somewhere so I remember that it will come out in July, and then it might be my first romantasy card. Yeah, I don't know. Unless I start reading other romantasy before that, and become a full-on book talk whatever person. Yeah, I also have like a lot of respect for people that actually finish writing a book. I'm definitely not part of that group yet. At least I finish reading books from time to time, a lot, because I'm really bad at DNF. I don't think I've ever not finished a book. I feel like I'm incapable of not finishing books, even if I hate them. Which is why I should probably be careful with like reading Stormlight this year, because what if I hate it? So yeah, congratulations for finishing both two books already. That's really cool. Are these like your first ever published books, or will these be your first ever published books, or have you published stuff before? 80% in, Cardia. That's at that point, I would probably just like power through because of sunk cost fallacy and whatnot. Unless something really, really, really fucked up happens where I'm like, I can't stop, I can't reading this because it's. And I have not encountered any books yet where that happens. I guess I'm just like a very, very unemotional person that can ignore most stuff and not get traumatized by anything. Which is, of course, because I'm a man, right? Sorry. Okay. Dare I ask which book you DNF'd at 80% in, Kadia? Or is that one of those things that will make me very sad? I read the Handmaid's Tale ages ago. I should probably reread it and read more of her stuff, but I have not. I think. Hey, how you doing, Eva? Yeah, I think to bring that back, I think with Atwood, I have this problem that she has so often stated that she's not writing science fiction, but speculative fiction, is trying to separate herself from like the larger genre, that I get these weird bad vibes in the same way I get them when Salman Rushdie calls the stuff he makes magical realism, to differentiate it from fantasy, where I'm like, you're playing elitist games here that I don't necessarily approve of, and that's sort of when I kind of why I have not actually gone in on Atwood as much as I should, because obviously she's a very, very talented writer. The same way that Salman Rushdie is technically a very talented writer, just also like a really, really annoying person. Yeah, no, that definitely won't make me sad, Claudia. I'm just fascinated that like you get bored by Gwyn, which is the one thing like that I didn't get. I didn't get bored. It's more like I don't like the stuff he does, but it feels like it's so action packed that it's very difficult to get bored, unless you get bored by a ton of guys waving around swords that get described in loving detail. That's a great title, though. The artificial structure, formerly known as the moon. So yeah, this is apparently today a general promotion stream for Ida and her fantasy and science fiction novels. So go get them, read them. I have not, but I'm sure they're great, because they're finished books, which is the first big quality here, and I like the titles. So yeah, go get them. Support a friend and fellow book person. Yeah, Midnight Children is great. The one Rushdie that didn't really work for me, Chris, was the what's it called, 2 years, 28 days, no, 2 years, 8 months, and 28 days. The 1001 Nights sort of retelling. It kind of didn't work for me that well, but yeah, obviously, Salman Rushdie knows how to, do word stuff. Wait, Anne Rice is on the literature shelf? I'm pretty sure that will make Salman Rushdie mad. But then I'm not a big Anne Rice reader, so I don't know. Maybe has high literary qualities. You'd have to ask Biggest for that. He's the Anne Rice person here, I assume. I agree, Kadia. It's an awesome title. Yeah. Hey, Drew. How you doing? I am astonishingly well for the way I've been spending the last 2 months. I am feeling good, and I finally got time to do a live stream, and I figured out a way to record videos again, which makes me very happy, because I have stuff I want to talk about, and it feels weird to do it the way that I'm doing it right now. But until I am finally rich and can get myself a new camera, it will be recorded Zoom meetings, basically, which is weird. How are you though, Drew? Um, Name of the Wind. I think it's. I mean, I think if I would have to do like shelves or whatever, I would do like realist and supernatural or whatever you want to call the other things to make sure that some stuff does have things in there that are impossible and some stuff does not. So Thomas Pynchon would probably mostly end up on the same shelf as well, possibly Name of the Wind, but you know. Ida, is that cat bringing you live mice now to prevent you from praying for rain, so it doesn't have to blame you anymore? Hey, Jin. Long, like very, very long time no see. How you doing, man? Nice. I mean, I'm sorry that it has been like a hard year, but glad that you're making progress out of corporate hell. And I obviously wish you a lot of success with that because no one wants to live in corporate hell and no one deserves to live in corporate hell, except maybe the people running corporations. They should probably just be in hell, period. Yeah, Infinite Jest is very much well. It's no longer sci-fi. We've had our show person president, haven't we? So I don't know. That being said, Infinite Jest was a very fun book to read. It's obviously weird, but I cannot recommend it enough. It does very interesting things. Also, lots of weed being smoked, which I think is something that you know goes back to the we need more psychedelics in our fantasy. I think there's at least enough psychedelia and other weirdness in Infinite Jest for it to be good epic fantasy, which it's not. Yeah, I think The Still Remains could potentially. I mean, it is just incredibly well executed as a book in period, like by no matter the genre, it's just like really, really well done. Shame about Richard K. Morgan being very British and very turfy. I mean, the British part I don't care that much about, but like him going all in gender critical feels, I don't know, well, very unfortunate. So luckily I read the books before I found out, so that made it much easier to appreciate them. But I'm definitely not going to give him any more money at this point, unless he changes his positions, because stuff I don't need to support. So yeah, that's these kind of things. Yeah, one of the things I want to do very soon, obviously, is like make videos again, but also go more like into like more analytical stuff again, in the way that I did read already parts of the Frederick Jameson thing, and there's another like book on Marxist literary criticism by Terry Eagleton that I want to read, and see if I can, use that stuff for like looking at fantasy books. That's another book that I want to check out. It's older, like from the early '80s, like fantasy, the literature of subversion. which is very like Marxist feminist theory about trying to define the fantasy genre from that perspective, and I think that might be interesting. Um, so I don't know what you're laughing about, biggest, but like I think beyond anything else, Richard K. Morgan publicly supporting J.K. Rowling was one of those things that I just didn't need. That should not exist. Like, no matter the position, Richard K. Morgan should be aware of the fact that J.K. Rowling is a terrible person, right? You'd think. But then again, he lives in England and stuff is weird over there. Um, the weird part, like I didn't talk about like that much, like with me not being able to record videos for like 2 months. All the stuff that I read in that time, if I want to talk about it, I have to reread it because I obviously forgot all of it because my brain's like very much like a sieve at this point, and I need to figure out which books I read are worth talking about in detail. I feel like probably some Desperate Glory, definitely the In Ascension by Martin McGuinness, and of course Saint of Bright Doors by the guy whose name I will not try to pronounce. Yeah, that's why I felt confident in saying that England is weird, Chris. It's like everyone I've spoken to over there is like, yeah, it's weird. Oh, that's another book I really want to read and need to read. The Sunken Land Begins to Rise by M. John Harrison. I don't know if you've read that, Chris. It's M. John Harrison writing a sci-fi novel, a weird or like postmodern, whatever, surrealist, whatever novel about Brexit. And if there's one person who can do that, then it's definitely M. John Harrison, who's very much not autobiography, also came out last year and is finally available in audio. So I'm going to get that one as well. Wish I Was Here, I think is the title of it. And I do very much appreciate what like M. John Harrison is doing in general. So that's one of those things that I definitely want to read as well. Yeah, Light is also really good, and then there's of course Viriconium and yeah, but yeah, Harrison is the kind of author where I'm like, yeah, he could probably tackle that and make it an interesting book for me to sort of like learn something and get like new perspectives beyond like, hey, this was a really stupid idea. I don't think anyone is over it at this point either. I don't think anyone is over Brexit in England or out there or outside of England. Everyone's like, how can you? Why? But maybe that's the thing. Like why? Like all of England, like the Brexit feels like after Brexit, post Brexit Britain feels to me like the most divorced country on the planet. It's like Elon Musk levels of being divorced, kind of in the way a lot of stuff happens in England afterwards. I'm like, yeah, England is basically a 40-something-year-old divorced man as a country. Which is really depressing for anyone who lives there and doesn't want that energy. So yeah. Anyway, yeah, read more M. John Harrison. I think we all should heed that one. And I really want to. Well, I have to reread the Illuminatus trilogy by Shane Wilson, and then I want to do a thing about that together with Foucault's Pendulum. And if I'm really ambitious, I'll also go and reread at least one of those Dan Brown novels to explain why they suck in comparison to these other books. Because I think there's an interesting thing going on there with like conspiracies and secret societies and occultism, um, where sort of comparing Foucault's pendulum and Illuminatus with Dan Brown sort of could potentially give like an insight or learn something, because I know people like the Dan Brown novels, and I recently got like backlash when I pointed out that I think that Dan Brown novels have had like a negative impact on people. I got like very angry replies to that, and I'm like, maybe I need to explain this, because I think there's something to be learned there about irony, about reality or the lack thereof, or consensus reality, about paranoia, and I think it's interesting to look at that in context. And I feel that Illuminatus, Foucault's Pendulum, and well, Dan Brown's novel, probably Da Vinci Code, or whichever the first one is. Those sort of like are three different approaches to the same thing, and comparing them might be a good idea. And I could probably pull in the what's it called, Richard Hofstadter's the paranoid style in American politics into that as well, because it does kind of all come together, and it does sort of very much sort of explain parts of the current of this round of the rise of global fascism, I guess. So I think there's something to be learned there. Well, Ori, to be frank, that's about like half the book already, so you're good. It's all sex scenes, and there's a meta commentary in there, because it's Illuminati, right? When they look through the files of that like magazine, and they have like the review of their book critic about a fictional book that is obviously not the Illuminati trilogy, which is like it's all it's all random conspiracy theories held together with sex scenes to create outrage, so it will be read. And I'm, you know, I like that approach. It's a good thing. Also, hey Ori, how you doing? So yeah, Illuminatus. I think it is more is more interesting as sort of an historical as a historical document than an actual novel. It's fun if you know a lot about the background of the books, about the people that are sort of involved with that, like sort of the new Illuminati, the whole like sort of weird counterculture, proto like early 60s 70s anarchist situationist influenced kind of approach to just like destroying consensus reality, the whole like Operation Mindfuck thing. uh it can be enjoyable in that regard if you have like that almost like Joker sort of like attitude, just like watching stuff burn. I think it can be entertaining in that regard, but mostly I think it's at this point a very interesting historical document about the 60s and 70s, especially in America, the ways, the absurdities of the Cold War, of the absurdities of a fundamentally almost fascist takeover of America back then with Nixon. The whole way this whole thing kind of how absurd some of it was, like during the Cold War, and I think it's a really interesting document for that. So it's worth reading in that regard. It kind of also ties back to a lot of the stuff that someone like say Thomas Pynchon writes about, like obviously from a different perspective, but it's sort of like that same form of America that got destroyed very quickly. That other America that could have been, if say 1968 would have had had panned out differently, if the state had not murdered the idea of maybe having a country that is less fucked up, I think. And in that regard, I think the Illuminatus trilogy can be a very interesting read. But it's also, deliberately obtuse and deliberately chaotic and jarring and weird. Viriconium, also. I'm glad that you're here for an hour already, Ori. I hope you're doing good. I hope you're doing good, in spite of all the odds and the world being on fire and everything. Anyway, so yeah, I think Illuminatus is very interesting in that regard. I think Foucault's pendulum also deals with that in a different direction that is also interesting. A far more like elitist, almost snobbish, like intellectual academic sort of way, which is obviously Umberto Eco's world in a lot of ways. And then you have Dan Brown, who just plays it straight and goes like, yeah, there's conspiracies. And then there's the question like, why do people really, really, really fall for Dan Brown? Is it because the stories are good? Is it because people really want to believe in these kind of conspiracies? And that's sort of where I think the Richard Hofstadter paranoid style in American politics kind of thing comes in. And there's a through line there that I think is that I want to look at in how sort of like this idea of reality shattering of, say, Operation Mindfuck, sort of made it easier to create to end up in a world where we don't necessarily have a consensus reality, and where, because of other trends where people really like to believe in conspiracies, we end up where something like Dan Brown suddenly can take over large swaths of reality just by playing to that strength, so to speak, or playing to that inclination of a lot of people to want to believe in conspiracies. And I think that's incredibly dangerous, but I think it's also something that needs to be examined. And I guess possibly I could use Moish Pastone's idea about like his essay on structural anti-Semitism from like 1981 ish, because the way he uses like Marx's fetish concept and applies it to like conspiracies, I think might be helpful there. I have not read On the Road yet. I want to, because I really enjoyed Naked Lunch and some of the other beat stuff. So I feel at some point I gotta read On the Road. Anyway, so now you know how I brainstorm videos and how I come up with video ideas, because the whole like Postone fetishism thing is something that just popped up in my head, which tells you a lot about like how terrible my brain is. But yeah, if you find me making a video on all of these subjects very soon, now you know why. Because someone forced me to reread Illuminatus, and I finally got to read Foucault's Pendulum, and then I got really mad at people saying nice things about Dan Brown. I feel that's it's kind of sad, but like a lot of times when I make videos beyond just talking about a book that I just read and I'm really excited about and want to talk about, like most of the time it's because someone made me really, really mad, and then I dig myself into like a terribly deep rabbit hole and read like way too many books to get angry in large detail. Okay, that one I don't get. Also, a Canadian professor of the U.S. Okay, I might just be too tired to get the full context of why this is weird. Because as I said before, I have not exactly slept a lot over the last 2 months, because I went traveling a lot. I talked about like why the Hunchback of Notre Dame is actually a bad book, and other stuff in Serbia, and then I traveled some more, and it's one of those things that now that I have like new medication, it does sort of give me a lot more energy, or at least it feels like that, but it's still something I need to channel into like a more productive thing. Well, funny that you are mentioning this, Chris. As alternate history, I incredibly highly recommend The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon, which is very, very good. I do recommend, I would recommend Unholy Land by Lavi Tidar, which is, I haven't checked like his interviews or whatever on the topic, but it feels very much like it is in conversation with the Yiddish Policemen's Union. I am currently reading Cahokia Jazz by Francis Spufford, which so far is a great read. But since I'm only in like 5 chapters, I'm hesitant with like fully recommending it. I'm just going like, so far I'm having a lot of fun with it. I think like the problem with a lot of alternate history stuff is that it often goes into like, so what if the Nazis won? And I'm like, yeah, that's not necessarily something that would make for a good novel. And it's definitely not something I want to contemplate. So I haven't read Fatherland. I guess at some point I will have to, and I haven't read The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, which is obviously sort of goes in a similar direction. Yeah, but like also, there's a like U.S. cultural studies thing in Germany. Like my university does have like a master's is it in American studies, which is very much American culture, cultural studies, but also a lot of literature because it's part of the literature department, I think. Well, the uniforms, yeah, biggest. It's like, I don't think the rest would be very good. Although, I mean, what with me, having a genetic defect slash disability, I guess I wouldn't be around in that kind of future, would I? So, yeah, as I was saying, me getting mad at stuff is how videos beyond just book stuff, individual book conversations happen, which is why I'm still going to do that Brandon Sanderson thing, which is probably something I should start very soon. What with there being quite a number of books, and them also not being the shortest of books, I should probably go and read what's it called, the first one he wrote, Elantris. That's the one, and then be angry about Elantris, and then other stuff. So yeah, I hope that like next time we do a stream in like sometime in June. Maybe I'll have another guest. I originally I planned to do a live stream at the end of April, but that didn't work out because of suddenly our us having like visitors at our flat for like 2 days, and me thus not being able to sit down in front of a screen for like a couple of hours on Saturday night. And I had a guest planned for that, and I hope they can come back next time because they didn't have time today. All right, what you gonna plug, biggest? Yeah. Oh, so I think like the larger the change kind of thing is, and the further back in time you go, the less this stuff feels like alternate history, because the more that history will diverge from what we have. So the what if the Nazis one thing feels relatively small compared to, yeah, what you said, like what if the Indo-European migration went somewhere else? Like, would that still even feel like a historical novel? Oh yeah, I read about that because that the Let It Be movie is out. I have not watched it for all kinds of reasons. The main reason being that I was on a tent with in a tent on a field, which is not helpful if you want to watch movies on Disney Plus, which I don't have. I mean, um, I think like the whole idea of alternate history sometimes. I mean, all historical novels are in a way alternate history because most of them do actually change stuff. And for the really fun stuff, you can always read The High Crusade by Poul Anderson, I think. Is it Poul Anderson? I think it's Poul Anderson, where a bunch of crusaders manage to steal an alien spaceship and do stuff. Well, also then I guess we would not have Guns, Germs, and Steel as a book, which might actually be a good thing, all things considered. Because it is not a very good book. But I think you also have read The Dawn of Everything, right? The Great Exchange, yeah. But see that's kind of the point also that like if once again if you do these like big things at that point the world you're creating becomes so very different that it doesn't really feel like alternate history because like the thing with alternate history I feel for a lot of books at least and for a lot of readers is like it is basically our world with one thing changed. But if you do that like gigantic change like the Indo-European migration going in a different direction or yeah, what if there were more domesticated domesticable animals in the Americas and so forth. At that point, that detail makes like everything else so unrecognizable. I think that it feels more like fantasy than actual alternate history. And at that point, yeah, you can just like write a fantasy story with that premise basically, and don't have the hassle of people complaining about you getting one historical detail wrong, which is usually what happens if you write history or historical fiction or alternate history, because people who think they are history nerds are primarily nerds and know very little about actual like history as an academic discipline. Unfortunately, they usually just want to talk about the specific impact, specific details, technical details of tanks. A lot of them, at least. And if you get that one tank wrong, you're you're obviously a fraud and don't deserve to write about history. You can tell I'm not a fan of military history people. I mean, obviously they creep me out, but also that attitude is something I really don't like. Yeah, I thought you had read Dawn of Everything. It's just interesting because I did, in fact, read or I have read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. So whenever they, whenever they explicitly mention him, and it's like I recognize, like, yeah, that was a really bad book and did a lot of stuff wrong. But it does obviously have that point is obviously still correct. That yeah, the lack of animals that could be easily domesticated in the Americas certainly had an impact. Yeah. So what else? I think like the problem with history or historical novels is that we often look at like, or a lot of people look at history and talk about history as if it is this highly deterministic kind of thing, where you have like easily explainable and discernible like causes and effects, and obviously there are cause and effect relations in stuff that turns into history over time, but most of them are so complex that you can't just basically just like flick a switch and history goes down a different course, and you can pinpoint and go like, this is the one thing that did it. I mean, obviously there are situations like that. The fact that there was a situation in World War I where an English soldier had like drawn a bead on Adolf Hitler, and Hitler remembers that, and we have the testimony of the guy that said like, yeah, I think that was me. And he didn't kill him. He didn't shoot Hitler. And you're like, well, that might have changed history, but really, I think it's rarely this clear cut. So I think the problem with like this kind of alternate history often is that it kind of builds up that idea that you can change history by just doing that one deed, and that's almost never the case. It's almost always the case that you need to shift structures slowly. You need to do this with a lot of people and so forth. That doesn't invalidate like individual actions. Of course, you need to do them, but the idea that there are simple solutions that can just like change something radical, that is something that like both historical novels and especially alternate history kind of has to deal with. And yeah, I don't know, it doesn't always appeal to me, but I don't read that much historical fiction anyway, or at least not that kind of historical fiction. It's kind of the stuff where like for example, like the Bernard Cornwell thing, when he writes historical fiction about stuff that is further in the past, he can get away with that. But like when he writes about the sharp books, in the same way that, say, what's the far superior George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman books sort of show that like individual characters just like have no influence whatsoever, and you can write about it, and you can build stuff around that, and make it interesting to read, but you have to sort of keep away from like your characters having like world-changing impact. That's something you can only do in fantasy, because fantasy doesn't do that sort of like historical realism in a lot of ways, unless you, of course, Joe Abercrombie, and the world just remains shit because nothing ever changes. Yeah, you're right. You can always change stuff in the present, but like, as I said, like Jen, like, right, it's difficult to do that, and it means a lot of people have to do small things at the same time to sort of change stuff. It's almost never just this one thing where you can suddenly like throw like history on like a different train track almost, right? And that's not how it works, and a lot of fiction kind of has to do that, however, because narratives are different. Like we tell stories about individuals making changes that actually have an impact immediately and so forth. And obviously, writing a novel, you have to simplify stuff. So I see where it's coming from. I just think that, especially with alternate history, it often kind of falls flat by simplifying stuff that, or maybe it's just a problem of like, having studied history at university, that you're like, well, that you kind of see where they're going wrong with these assumptions, and then you have people taking that stuff seriously, because obviously we read a lot of fiction. A lot of times when we read fiction, especially with historical fiction and sometimes even alternate history stuff, it's very easy for a lot of people to sort of confuse that with like to take it as like almost as history, right? You read a historical fiction novel about something, and you're like, well, I guess now I know something about history. And it's like, just because you've read a historical novel set in medieval France, you don't know much about medieval France beyond, well, I guess there's guys with swords and horses and peasants who are always dirty and everything is gray and brown. Um, which is obviously already wrong. But that kind of problem that like we take historical fiction and read it as history oftentimes, because popular history books often are like follow the same kind of thing and are heavily narrativized, and especially with like alternate history stuff that is set in places that I know stuff about. uh, yeah, usually just makes me angry. Has it though? Also, has it had like positive changes in its government? I mean, if we're fair, you have a new king at the end of like one, and then nothing really changes. That's exactly kind of the depressing part of when you read the second trilogy, I think. But then, of course, we get like our wise wizard Bias plotting the next form when the globe will be encompassed by railroads that all sprout from the hand of this one person in that vision. And I'm like, yeah, people encompassing the globe with rails, tentacles, or whatever. That's maybe imagery you want to shy away from, especially if you also connect that person encompassing the globe with banks. Yeah, and that's the point also, that like it always goes back to individuals conspiring and having individuals having that level of power, and that's something that doesn't exist in the real world. No individual human has that much power. I mean, very few have any power, like to do a lot of stuff. Possibly, a bunch of dictators, yes, but even there's like, even if a certain orange guy will become God King of the United States of America, or the the Christian Confederacy of America next year, right? Even if that happens, if someone like Trump would go like, "Hey, nukes now," do you think that like the military would actually go through with that? I don't know that, but I suspect it will be more difficult to, as an individual, do anything, because our world has become so complex, and so much of it is just like structures that we have built and that we are now sort of all trapped in, most of us trapped in. And I think that's something that kind of obviously is difficult to pull off in like a fantasy novel, in any form of novel, unless it's your Kafka style depressing short story. But I think it's important to understand that there's a difference between the way fiction depicts the world and the way the world is, and we often kind of forget that. Or on the other hand, we kind of underestimate how much the stories we read and the stories we tell influence we actually act and see the world afterwards. Like, the books we read turn us into the people that we are, and we kind of underestimate that, or overestimate our ability to differentiate between the stuff we read and or the stories we consume, and the world, and seeing them as fiction. I think we often overestimate how much we can sort of see through that, because it's very, very easy to just like go fall into these narratives, subconsciously mostly, I guess. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the problem, right? Banks are just like one of these prime examples. Like, do I have issues with, say, the current leadership of something like Morgan Chase or whatever? Sure, I do. But do I think that I just like, dragging them out behind the shed and shooting them will, in fact, actually change anything? No, because they are obviously doing the things that the system, the form of capitalism that we set up, the form of neoliberal late stage capitalism that we have, the way we've built up that machine, right? That will move on no matter the names of the people nominally in charge. And I think that's one of those things that I find interesting in the way where I'm like, that's something that cyberpunk especially like William Gibson's kind of cyberpunk gets right, the idea that it's humans versus a machine that humans built. It's not necessarily about individual humans confronting other individual humans, because no individual human has that level of power anymore. We're trapped in that machine, even if we may be, trapped on like a higher power level, right? Hey, Britton, how you doing? Yeah, I've heard that saying. I've also read Douglas Adams when he goes, "Well, people are a problem," and yeah, of course, that's one part. Is like humanity as a group has a very, very high level of inertia. It's very difficult to change anything because lots of people's with their personal interests and so forth make stuff very difficult. I still think it's worth the effort to make the world a better place. We all should try to do that in whatever way we can, but it's highly frustrating because it's yeah. I guess we have to imagine ourselves happy with that rock. And now the chat has moved. I've heard about this P.L. Stewart. I've never read any of his books. Well, also, if you tell yourself the story that you are Baudrillard, maybe. Yeah, but I think that's one of the reasons why I personally really like Terry Pratchett is that this world is very much all about the power of stories and the way the stories we tell ourselves are important. He does a lot of that, and because it's Terry Pratchett, right? He's also really clever about it, and he has that whole idea of narrative causality, where things happen because that's how stuff happens in stories, and that's just like how the world works. And well, making fun of it, but also applying it to your own world is like a very, very clever way of explaining that power of stories. Hey, yeah, well, Britain, I will brush up on my Mormon knowledge then. If you have anything in particular, you can just like text me and I'll double check, unless, you just want to spring some deep Mormon lore on me. Uh, but yeah, certainly I need to get back to my general Mormon studies stuff and actually get that video on the way so I can finally do the Brandon Sanderson thing and then read, all that stuff and talk about why I think Sanderson is probably a very, very nice human being, but there's also a lot of stuff about Brandon Sanderson, the public figure, writer, publisher, and so forth, actor within the fantasy sphere that I disagree with or find disagreeable. And yeah, that's something that I really want to get back to. I mean, I still have like fragments of like the Sanderson video I want to make from like last year around this time. I started last year around this time to make that video, and then never got to the point where it actually coalesced. So this is still very much weighing on my mind because I'm really bad at like letting stuff go. So this is going to happen. I'm gonna do the thing. I want to get that white whale of mine. And don't tell me how Moby Dick ends. I'm pretty sure everyone's fine, and Ahab just gets the whale, and everyone's happy afterwards. Right? It's basically like a romance. It has a happy end. Yeah, I didn't know that, Britain. I read the Book of Mormon. I did know that. Yeah, you're right, Jin. Like, I don't necessarily believe in like the metaphysical aspect of karma, but yeah, of course, if you're a good guy and are nice to other people, generally that will make most people also more happy, and happier people tend to be nicer to other people, and so forth. It obviously works on a practical level. I agree, and I think maybe karma is just a good way of explaining it, sort of. So yeah, yeah. Also, I guess you're technically a Lamanite, which is all kinds of fucked up when you're looking into your like Mormon church history and how they um, did or did not interact with native groups and native believers and so forth. There's some interesting stuff there, especially if you read like the Benjamin Parks, what's it called, American Zion, which is a pretty concise and good history of the Mormon Church, and goes into some of that stuff. And then, of course, if you like have more specific sort of like focused stuff about the specific parts of Mormon belief, Mormon history, Mormon Church, and so forth, and the Young Mormon Study thing. I keep forgetting what the book is called. There's a book that came out of that like study, like research project where they interviewed a lot of like Mormons in general, about like faith, belief, and so forth, to look at like how attitudes within the religion have changed between like the silent generation, the boomers, the millennials, and Gen X, the millennials, and so forth. It doesn't go all the way to Gen Z because it was originally done, I think, like slightly too early to consider Gen Z as its own specific generation. But as a book, I think I found it very interesting. It mostly just reproduces the study results and talks about what people believe, how people's attitudes have changed towards practicing Mormonism versus believing stuff and so forth. So it's really interesting in that regard. And they have like a couple of questions, or like one part in that book is about specifically native representation within the Mormon Church, or lack thereof, and how people sort of deal with that and build around that. So it's a very unique, kind of fascinating thing, Mormonism, in that regard. Ida, I don't know when I have bought it. It is in my Audible library as we speak. I pre-ordered it, and so forth. But because I'm really bad at reading long series apart, and if possible, if at all possible, want to just like read them stop to finish, I'm in a bit of a predicament, as we say, because I have no idea when the second audio volume audiobook will come out, and so forth. Books 10 and 11 are already out, but books 2 to 9 are currently missing. I mean, wait, 11 is not yet out. It's coming out like, I don't know, 2 weeks, sometime in May, in audio. But I'm missing the rest, so I'm not sure if I want to read Curse of the Mystery right now and then have to wait forever, or if I'll just like do nothing about it and read it whenever I have all of them, which will probably be in like 5 years or so. So maybe I should just like read the first one to find out if I'm into this, and then reread it whenever I do more. Yeah, Chris, lots of blubber. That's certainly true. That's another book that I should actually reread, because it's been 20 years since I last read Moby Dick, and I was very impressed, but I was also very much struggling because it's like one of the first like capital L literature, like long ass books that I read in English. And I'm sure I missed a lot of stuff. I was very impressed by it back then, though. So yeah, Moby Dick also maybe slightly gayer than most people realize. But I did reread Bartleby the Scrivener last year, and I really enjoyed that one as well. I should probably read more Melville at some point. I did see that Winnie the Pooh meme also. I very much loved it. I saw it this morning, and I had to share it with some friends who also very much appreciated it. Hey, good morning, Kel. What time zone are you in that it is morning for you now? I would probably. So here's the thing: I would not buy that book. In if the author is someone I think I dislike, I feel is evil in any form, no matter the quality of the book, I would not want to give that person money. Now, if that person is dead and the money does not go to that person anymore, say H.P. Lovecraft, right? Then yeah, I'll probably buy a version of it because But if the person is still alive, like say one Orson Scott Card, I will not buy Ender's Game. That's out of the question. I mean, possibly I would buy it secondhand, but I don't want to support people monetarily that I dislike, no matter the quality of their work. I Yeah, just don't do that. Joseph Stalin's Winnie the Pooh would be like a very, very interesting book indeed. Also, I don't think Joseph Stalin was like the most evil person in the world. He was obviously not a good guy. He was also like an incredible wreck for large parts of his life in all kinds of ways. But I feel like you know there's that whole idea that like power corrupts and so forth. I think like being 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 Joseph Stalin, or like being in the situation of Joseph Stalin during the time and so forth, that will probably fuck up most people. But I'm not here to give absolutions to Joseph Stalin. He was, well, a mass murderer and a lot of other things. But I think it's easy to go into that whole like, oh, the most evil person in the world. I don't care about the most evil person in the world. I care about the fact that there's like way more people that are just like just evil and have impact on me right now. And that's we don't need to do buddy counts here. Is my point at that point in that situation. Hey Teddy, how you doing? That's good to know, Ida. I guess in that case, I will just read Curse of the Mist Wraith and see what I like, and then take it from there. I am very much interested. I hope it's. I'm expecting big things of it, but I'm also kind of scared that it might have been overhyped by everyone who has read it, and everyone is. I'm very happy that Jenny Wirtz is getting the attention that she's getting recently on a very, very, very small part of fantasy booktube of like I guess 3 booktubers and 50 people watching the videos or whatever. So I'm very, very happy about that. I just think you know I'm just naturally very like very when I see people telling me that a book is incredibly good. because then I'm always like, I don't know. It's why I have not yet started Sun Eater, because I feel it might be somewhat overhyped. I also think some of the people overhyping it have book tastes that I violently disagree with, and if they think it's a good book, I'm kind of scared. Breton, I don't know if I have a cult, so you're probably not a bad cult follower because I don't think there exists a cult. With Marion Zimmer Bradley, Britain, I think it's so. Here's the thing: it's like I read Mist of Avalon last year, and I knew about the stuff before. I think with Marion Zimmer Bradley's case in particular, I do really appreciate the way the publisher went about the whole thing once the whole testimony came out and everyone knew stuff about heard about like all the child abuse and everything. The fact that they're just donating the profits they make from selling Marion Zimmer Bradley books at this point, they're just donating the profits to charities that help you know victims of child abuse. I think that's a very very it's probably the best way you can go about this as a publisher, I think. So that's good. So I don't have like a moral issue with spending money on buying Marion Zimmer Bradley book. um I I read it, and I had enough other issues with it for me for that part not to be like the biggest problem, right? It's like, I'm good at sort of like um pushing these things to the side. Obviously, they will always impact me. Knowing stuff about an author will always impact my reading. I think there's no way of fully separating art and artist, except of just not knowing who the artist is. Like as soon as you know stuff, it will impact your perception and in some way or other. But like, that's a different thing, right? Like um, I am good at reading stuff by people I disagree with, I find reprehensible and so forth. As I said, like I've read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft. I even like some of it. Other stuff I don't like that much. I've read, like, especially if you read older authors, chances are you might disagree with them. Like I absolutely, well, love is probably the wrong word, but like I'm a huge fan, or like Robert E. Howard and especially the Conan stuff has had a huge impact on me as a person. I disagree with a lot of Robert E. Howard's stances and so forth. He's maybe not as terrible as Lovecraft when it comes to like the racism, but it's still there, right? So the reading is one thing. I would even read Ender's Game, but like giving money to people that are actively causing harm with the stuff they're doing, right? That's a different thing. That's why I would not give money to, say, J.K. Rowling. I mean, obviously, I don't have like any big interest in reading Harry Potter anyway. But at this point, I don't want to do that. And with like someone like Card as well, it's like someone who has actively said that they are donating money they make through book sales to charity to organizations that do conversion therapy. At that point, if I buy that book, I am paying for conversion therapy, which I think is evil and wrong. So I will not do that. Would I come into possession of a copy of, say, Ender's Game, which I assume is a good book, sort of, or everyone tells me so, right? If I would come in possession of one of those, one of his books, without any money ending up in Orson Scott Card's pockets, of course I would read it at that point because I'm curious. I want to find out what people think. That includes terrible people. Yeah, that's like another part, like her daughter being like her autobiography book being published by Vox Day, who is an insane person and a fascist. Yeah, Nazis kind of suck. And yeah, Dragonbone Chair is really good. So yeah, Dragonbone Chair is really good. I find Simon annoying, but that's because I recognize a lot of my own behavior in like my younger self's behavior in Simon, which is a different form of annoying from like a badly written character. It's really well written, and I was surprised by how well most of it held up when I reread them last year, like in autumn. And I was positively surprised by The Heart of What Was Lost, which is sort of like the bridge novella novel. I mean, it's a novel, but for like Ted Williams, it's probably like a novella because it's only 350 pages or something like that. It's so yeah. I'm glad Ted Williams has a bit of a sort of renaissance at the moment, with more people kind of reading him finally. The only problem, like with Ted Williams, usually is that he's really good at world building. He's good at characters. He's incredibly bad at ending his stories. Dragonbone Chair, like Memories or Thorn, kind of works. Otherland is insanely bad as an ending. The ending is really bad. Well, yeah, I have no opinions on Harry Potter. I read the first book when my sister got into it. My sister is younger than me. At that point, I had already read some Conan, and I had already read Lord of the Rings and even parts of the Silmarillion. And at that point, or I had finished the Silmarillion at that point. So at that point, Harry Potter just didn't work for me. I'm slightly too old to enjoy Harry Potter, I think. I was slightly too old to enjoy it back then. And now I'm like, I don't think I need to read this. Maybe at some point in the future for like, once again, like historical reasons, because of course it was an incredibly influential series of books. So yeah, but like no judgments on Harry Potter for me. It might actually be good. I don't know. So yeah, I don't know. And I agree that J.K. Rowling should have stopped talking like years ago. But in the current climate, within the levels of like culture war that we have, she won't stop talking, and well, she's actively causing harm at this point because she either actively chooses to to do terrible things or lets herself be used and by people who actively cause harm. So my sympathies for her are somewhat limited. But I think that's kind of the point, right? It's like you have people who are used to a lot of like positive applause, and when they maybe make a mistake or say something slightly wrong or whatever, like harmless at the beginning, right? They get like backlash for the first time in like years. It's very easy for that kind of person, especially in like a social media environment, like a Twitter or whatever environment, right? It's very easy to then just like go where they still get applause, which it's the same thing with like Jordan Peterson. Just like obviously Peterson is his own like very fucked up person, but I think the mechanism of someone who starts out as like maybe slightly conservative or whatever, um for that kind of person to slide into like more and more like fascist radicalization because the general love of the public kind of gets taken away, so they move where they still get applause, and that's like a form of like radicalization that I think we'll see more of in the future. And I feel like J.K. Rowling is one case where that is, where that happened, and it's depressing to see, but if you're actively causing harm, my sympathies are very limited. I have not read all of Mein Kampf. I've read parts, of course, because you study history and so forth. I don't think there's that much to be learned from it, and yes, it's incredibly badly written. It's not. Look, there's there's other terrible people that have written better books. Joseph Stalin, for example, there are like essays and stuff that Stalin wrote in the 20s and so forth that are coherent coherent texts, which is something you can't say about Hitler's book. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the point, Ida. It's like knowing that she hurts people, but she doesn't care because she believes, and that's sort of like that bubble that the people that are hurt are not actually hurt, and it's a very specific kind of thing that I feel like middle-aged people that sort of came to the internet like later in life than say Gen Z or no, probably millennials as well, but that kind of came to the internet later are like very, very susceptible to that sort of like self-radicalization when they say something that slightly feels out of place and then they fall into that like weird hole. I have not read all of Ted Williams. I have not read Shadow March, and I still haven't. Obviously, I haven't started on the Last King of Ostenard, which the final book will come out this year because it was pushed back. My plan was to read all of them like last year, and then Navigator's Children got pushed back, and then I didn't move on. Um, but see, that's the point. Maybe that's like just like a point of difference on with like schooling and so forth, Britain, right? It's like I agree that that what is written in Mein Kampf is very much Hitler's opinion, but like if you go through like the German school system and then go to university and even study history, it's like at that point I don't need to read more than like a couple of excerpts from Mein Kampf to you read like you read one or two excerpts, you get the picture at that point. Is my point. It's like I hope the mouse finds its way out of your house because mice are kind of cute. I think. No. But obviously, it can be a waste of time. As like I said, like I have read excerpts, and I'm fine with that. I'm just not too interested in more of Hitler's personality. I don't think I mean, while Hitler as an individual obviously had a huge impact on German history, on German history, of course, I think I'm more interested in looking at whenever I actually think about like Nazis, which I try to not do too much. I think it's more important to look at like the structures that were in place long before Hitler that made it possible for someone like that to actually, have that much impact. And I think those elements are it's more fruitful to look at that stuff because there's always going to be racist maniacs. The problem is if you have like if you have a structure, if you have a system that allows racist maniacs to get into power, that's sort of like where I'm more interested in. But yeah, it's I think it can be helpful to look at like Mein Kampf for people who think like it can be a way of demystifying Hitler because it is very incoherent in a lot of ways and it's badly written and it's a shit book. And there's this tendency if you have someone, especially like Hitler, that gets like demonized in media a lot, it's very easy to sort of like turn them into something inhuman in a way, and that's a problem because like Hitler, obviously, like a lot of other terrible people, was still very much a human person with all kind, but like both trying to psychoanalyze Hitler and how he became who he was and so forth. That doesn't lead anywhere. And trying to turn him into like this evil super genius, that also doesn't work because he's just a guy who ended up in a situation where he had like way more power than he should have had, and because he was a racist maniac. Yeah, that's what happened. But there's a tendency to focus too much on Hitler and not look at like the large structural thing. I think it's easy to do that because he looks ridiculous. These speeches are ridiculous, or powerful, depending on what, like the cult of personality that was built around Hitler during the Nazi time makes it easy to sort of fall into the same trap and still just focus just on the guy instead of the entire structure around it. And I think that's why I'm always a bit wary of Hitler stuff. No, it's Kampf with an A, Ida. As I said, like, I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of stuff like with that German annoyance with Hitler. I was like, as I said, like, if you go through a German school system, you are going to get taught about Nazis a lot, which, once again, makes a lot of sense. But like, you do that for like 12 years in school, and you have like, out of like 12 years at school, you probably have like 8 years in which Hitler comes up at some point, or like Nazis come up at some point or other, whether it's like in ethics class or in politics class or in history class or in German class when you read some literature around about the topic and so forth. It comes up a lot, so you get really really bored by the topic, which also has its dangers because it kind of makes it easy to just like shrug your shoulder and ignore the dangers that are in there because you're just like so fed up with the whole topic, I think. I don't think Hitler himself was that competent. He had like a system around him with a lot of very competent people in other areas. Hitler was not the most competent person out there, especially when it comes to like larger politics and military stuff. So I don't know if he was more competent than Trump. It's once again, I don't think it's that kind of comparison. I don't think you can get much out of it. It's usually the problem is that once you build that fascist system, right? The problem is that you allow a lot of people in like middle management and so forth under the main guy. You allow a lot of people in those different positions of like lesser power to use their power to do a lot of harm, and that's like where the danger lies. Right? Trump being an idiot is one thing. Having Mitch McConnell in the background sort of like stack the courts and have all these like other neocons do all the terrible shit. That's where the danger lies. It's not so much the guy at the top. Yeah, the banality of evil. Have you read Eichmann in Jerusalem, also? I mean, I remember you reading some Hannah Arendt. That's, you know, yeah, Trump definitely didn't necessarily help make the U.S. look good. That's definitely true. But I think, yeah, I think the interesting part is that looking back at Hitler, we find him ridiculous, right? The mustache looks incredibly ridiculous, and all these um, his speeches, the way he acts on stage, like feel ridiculous from our perspective now. I don't think people in the 1930s did not necessarily find the mustache obviously not the mustache, because the mustache had like a historical propaganda reason, but like didn't find the speeches or whatever ridiculous, because the general style of politics was a different one. Whereas with Trump, there's a lot of people who found Trump ridiculous during his presidency and before and so forth. So I think there's a slight difference there. Hitler Twitter might have been very funny. Yeah, that I agree with that. I think to the comparison, like I don't think Trump and Hitler are that comparable, in that Hitler was a true believer. Like from all we can tell, Hitler was very much a true believer in all the racist, anti-Semitic, and stuff of like bullshit the Nazis did. I am not sure if Trump believes in anything beyond just himself. So I think I don't know if Trump is like racist beyond just like your average background racism. He uses racism obviously to get to power and money and so forth. But I don't think Trump really has like a full blown like ideology of anything behind it. He just like plays at being a fascist because that's like the way that will get him what he wants. So I think that's maybe a different. It's not necessarily a difference in outcome, but it feels like there's a difference in attitude. I think, if that makes sense. That is true. The Great Dictator is in fact a very good film. All right, guys, my beer is empty, and it is already like 11:40 ish. So we've been going for like almost 3 hours. And as I mentioned, I've spent the last 2 nights sleeping very little in a tent on a field on a very rough ground, and it was pretty cold. It was like 5 degrees, like Celsius at night. So I feel like maybe I should just actually get some sleep for once, and maybe I'll manage to record a video on Snuff by Terry Pratchett, my first Snuff video, so to speak. Maybe I'll get to do that tomorrow, and wouldn't that be nice? And yeah, thanks for hanging out. It's great that I'm finally back on the internets, on the YouTubes, and so forth. I'm very much looking forward to once again annoying everyone with videos and hanging out with you. I'm really looking forward to talking on Wednesday, Britain. That will be a lot of fun. And maybe even Mormon stuff. We'll see how that goes. And yeah, I know. Catch you guys around somewhere on, I don't know, Discord. Maybe I'll pop in tomorrow at what's this Matt on Books Sunday pub. If I'm not at the Smolder and Gatekeeper show tomorrow. That's something that might happen. Although they canceled the show today, so maybe it also gets canceled. I don't know. So maybe see some of you tomorrow. Otherwise, see you with videos and wherever else I happen to be on the internet or anywhere else where you might be, which, might be everywhere because I'm hard to pin down. All right, here's the button. So yeah, see you guys. Thanks for hanging out. It was a lot of fun.